Welcome to the Dave Palma Show, the podcast that revives, restores, and awakens your innermost capabilities.
You have the training and the talent to succeed, but do you have the guts to fail?
I love what I do. When you love what you do, you want to be the best at it.
Today is about the power of you. You will change the world.
Find your path to success through the journey of those who have succeeded. And now, your host, Dave Palma.
Hi, welcome back to the Dave Palma Show. And with me in this episode, I have the author of Out of the Darkness Chronicles, the journey of a 19th century child coal miner as he rises from the ashes of poverty and tragedy to reach for his dreams. David Jacinto, welcome to the Dave Palma Show.
Well, thank you, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity.
It's absolutely a pleasure having authors like yourself who inspires people. You've written a novel, of course, but you have an inspiring story background as well yourself, which people can check out in the show notes bio. So tell us a little bit about yourself before we talk about your book.
Well, you know, this has been something that's been a passion for me to write. I'm actually a real estate developer.
Okay. Yeah.
And,
So tell us your journey then, from when you was a kid, and I know you was an immigrant or something, or some.
Well, my wife is an immigrant from.
Oh,
Cardiff.
Sorry. Okay, let's start from the beginning then. Let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking, let me just get to your story actually before I get confused.
Sure.
Yeah. So you were born into a family living on the wrong side of the tracks, and been a storyteller ever since. So I should have really said that at the beginning. So let's take it from there.
Well, my family was born in a pretty poor area. My mom was an orphan.
Oh, okay.
And,
all right.
Interestingly enough, we didn't really hear anything about her family, her birth family, until she was about ready to pass away. She was living in Louisiana, which is about almost 3,000 miles from me, about 5 years ago, and I had written another book, and it hadn't been published yet, but she was interested in hearing the stories, and so I flew to Louisiana to read her a couple of the stories because she was blind at the time and had cancer and a whole bunch of other things.
You had cancer?
Yes, during that time.
Oh, yeah.
I read
where was your cancer? Or you don't want to talk about it?
She had cancer all over her body by this time. I didn't realize what kind of condition she was in. She was living with my sister until I arrived and saw her, and I read her a couple of stories. And as I was reading the story, she was telling me about her birth family, that's things that I had never heard before.
Yeah.
And as we talked about it, I learned more about her birth family, and she learned about this book that I wrote. Over about a period of about 8 days, I learned a lot about her family, and she asked to be buried in this little town in Wyoming. So when she was buried in this little town in Wyoming, I noticed that the largest tombstones in this entire cemetery were my great-great-grandparents. And it took me on a journey about my family and who I was, which I didn't realize I even had these relatives. I grew up with one cousin, and it turns out that in Wyoming, I have hundreds of cousins.
All right, yeah, it gets like that, doesn't it?
Story.
Yeah.
So in the end, I ended up spending about 2.5 years researching this family, and it's a fascinating story. And so that's what Out of the Darkness is about.
Oh, right. Okay, so it's research based, but it's a novel. Is that right?
It's a novel, but the people are real.
Oh, okay.
The events, which happen all in the UK.
Yeah.
But the interpersonal relationships between the main characters are fictional. So that's why it's historical fiction. It's done very well. It's #1 on Amazon in its class.
Okay. Yeah.
Now.
So if we was watching a movie adaptation of this, it would be called based on the true story of, like that.
That's right, like that.
but the names are changed, characters change, whatever, like that
The
kind of
names
thing.
are not even changed. They're
Oh,
real people,
okay.
real names, real
Oh,
events.
okay. All right. So,
And fascinating and
yeah, yeah.
fascinating folks in the UK as well that
Mm.
I didn't know anything about, but are now infamous in your country.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. How did you go about researching them, and what did you find out?
Well, it's interesting when as I mentioned, I was at the cemetery, and the two largest tombstones in the cemetery are my great great grandparents. And this little town in Wyoming is close to the Salt Lake City Genealogical Library, which is the biggest genealogical library in the world. And
Yeah.
so I drove the hour to that location, and spent about 4 or 5 hours that first day with these little old lady docents who helped me research this family. I left with a stack of information about them and went back to that little town, met the historical director of that county, and she spent a day with me researching everything they had in their historical records.
Mm.
And from there, I
It's a long
started
day.
a journey, part of it in the UK, part of it delving further into the internet on various issues. I visited the Wentworth Woodhouse Mansion, which
Yeah.
is the largest country home in all of Europe, and it's
Oh,
in Yorkshire.
okay. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of yeah, like the industrial. That's a very key area for the Industrial Revolution. Um,
Right,
and as you can imagine, there's a place called York, which is
right.
obviously everywhere in America is called New something, New England, New York.
That's
So
right.
you've got New York based on New York, and it's all come from the Industrial Revolution anyway. So
That's right.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
So
Anyway, with the Wentworth Woodhouse home is now being transformed into a museum, and I understand it was open for a while, and now they've been renovating it for a number of years. When I was there, they were in the midst of renovating it, and I had the opportunity to meet with some of the folks who were renovating it. But it's an enormous home. It's 255,000 square feet, and that's where Lord Fitzwilliam
yeah,
lived. And Lord Fitzwilliam owned the mines, owned the village, owned the mortgage on the lives of all
yeah,
these families. And the story is about a child in one of these families, Thomas Wright, who works in one of the mines. He begins his work with Lord Fitzwilliam in this mine at the age of 7. And at the end of the first year, there's an enormous accident which kills 26 children.
yeah,
11 of them are little girls, and it starts him on a path of fighting child labor. His mom, who was a maid in Lord Fitzwilliam's home, one of 450 servants at the time, had become self-educated and a voracious reader, and so she was an impetus for him to actually get out of the mine and to go ahead and begin his fight against child labor, which is a
mm.
fascinating story.
Wow, wow, fantastic. So, I mean, I've got here that it explores it. Obviously, the history unpacks child labor against the obviously what you said. So, it says after disaster strikes, many of his friends die in a mine explosion, and his self-educated mother decided that Tommy and his siblings would have a different fate. So take us
Right.
on from there. What happened?
Sure. Well, he starts work in a mine called Silkstone, which um, is not particularly a large mine. It was 300-400 feet under the ground,
Yeah.
very poorly constructed. He spent 6 days a week, 12 hours a day in the pitch blackness.
Oof.
It wasn't even a single candle provided by the company.
Yeah, yeah.
In this particular case, because his mother was so intent upon him continuing his education, because she had actually taught him to read by then, and he was reading books by the time he was 7. His father, who had been a coal miner in a coal miner family, 100 years, couldn't even write his own name. So there was it was a combination between a woman who was extremely well read and the mother, and a father who was very uneducated and assumed his children, like he and his grandparents before him, would work in a mine for Lords Fitzwilliam and other coal mine owners for the rest of their lives. That's just the way it was going to be. And she had an entirely different plan. And so he goes into the mine thinking that I'm going to join my father's heritage, and he was excited about it to begin with, until he actually experienced it, and it was so difficult. It was a struggle for him. You can imagine, if you have I know you have a child, because we were just talking about it. Imagine your 7-year-old child in those kind of conditions. And the only full-time companion were rats. And I did some research on those rats, pretty fascinating at the time. Some of those rats got as long as a foot and a half, 2 feet long.
Well,
so they were
that's
almost
big.
as small as a child. And
that's scary, isn't it?
You have that one candle flickering away, and you could see rats. I'm sure it was a little intimidating for a child of 7.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, those days also, I mean, I did some trade union work and looked at the history, and there wasn't any, and that's how it started, because women and children, that, I mean, there were kids and women that were just getting decapitated and things like that from machines from the Industrial Revolution, because there was no health and safety in place and things like that.
I mean, the average child who worked in the during the Industrial Revolution lived to the age of 22. So they didn't make it very long. Coal was actually a little better, because they were, at least for the most part, out. At least they lived out into the hills, and the pollution wasn't quite so bad. Although they spent most all their time underground. I mean, he would go into the coal mine before the sun came up, and come out of the coal mine after the sun went down, 6 days a week. So the only day he would even see the sun was on Sunday. And that's one of the reasons they call it Sunday. Very difficult life. When they have a disaster, they have the disaster in 1838. This is in the 1830s through the 1860s, this particular book. And it's part of a 2-book series, by the way. The first book is in the UK, and the second book is in America. But in 1838, they had a disaster in Silkstone where 26 children were killed. Part of that disaster, obviously he didn't die, but his little buddies died, and they didn't have enough money to even bury the children. So they buried all the children in a mass grave. And these are families just like yours and mine that must have struggled very. That's the fictional part of the book, is that describing the relationships in these families, and how they dealt with these disasters and challenges, and the life they lived. The ownership of a massively wealthy lord and lady. They had this enormous house with a family of 6. It took a servant an entire day to walk from one room to the other, not cleaning them, just walk from one room to the other, entire work day. And yet the coal miner, with a family of 6, lived in a 10 by 12 shanty outside the mine with no indoor plumbing. They had to stand in a queue for the bathroom, the loo.
The loo, that's it.
The other end of the block, stand in a queue for
the Johnny. Whatever. No, sorry, no.
Very difficult. Very difficult.
Well, excellent. Well, you say you've got two books there. I mean, I mentioned also about obviously with my trade union, obviously in the fire service, it is a health and safety orientated job. So yeah, being a member of trade union is probably a good idea. But it says there, as Tommy matures, he determines his own fate by defying odds to excel an engineering career and waging a noble fight against child labor, which obviously is where the trade unions came in as well because of child labor. It still goes on now, actually, around obviously more around Asia and places like that, Cambodia, Vietnam, bolstered by family, faith, and the love of a strong, determined woman. Tommy confronts his suppressors and eventually immigrating to America to pursue the life of his dreams. Tell us what happens there. Is that the second book?
Well, yeah, there's a second book. I could tell you more about the first, but let me tell you about
Okay. Yeah, tell us
second.
about first book first. Yeah, otherwise.
Okay, well, let me just finish that a little bit. He as I mentioned, is educated by his mother.
Yeah.
Desperate to have her children do something besides live their lives 500 to 1,000 feet below ground, which is what the coal miners did and usually died young. His father, contracts black lung as a relatively young man, and Tommy and his brothers are forced to go back in the mine after they were pulled out. When that event, that disaster occurred, when the 26 children were killed, his mom decided, I'm pulling my children out of the mine. I don't want them doing this. It's too dangerous. And of course, his father was very upset about it, but she prevailed. And for a period of time, Tommy was pulled out of the mine and continued his education under her. And he was a voracious reader himself and fascinated by technology. And he became a very successful engineer, self-taught engineer. And although he does have to go back into the mine when his father contracts black lung, because it's only the children that can afford to keep the food on the table. So he and his brother go back in the mine, but he becomes a very successful engineer and eventually works with Lord Fitzwilliam on a number of mines to solve some of their technological problems. But along the way, he is intent upon improving the safety conditions of the mines. And so wherever he has an opportunity to do an improvement, he always includes safety components. And he is intent upon getting children out of the mine. In fact, his mom works with Lords Ashley right after that first disaster. And they work with Queen Victoria and change some of the laws with child coal mining. The first thing they change is that little girls can no longer go in the mine.
Yeah.
That's a big deal at the time.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Later, he becomes more involved with various different influential folks. And there's another enormous disaster called the Oaks disaster, which killed 385 men and boys, and it's the largest in the UK ever. And he's involved in that as well as Lord Fitzwilliam. And because of Thomas, an inquest is forced. And even though the powers to be, which is the Lord and the Lady who basically own and run the land, finish the inquest with no responsibility for themselves, this inquest becomes a national issue. And all over the UK, folks are watching day by day what's happening because the press is there. And each day that the inquest goes on, there are more and more press, and it becomes a national scandal. Queen Victoria gets involved, and eventually they change more laws for child labor in a whole myriad of areas, not just in coal mining, but in other industrial areas as well. And through a series of events, which I won't tell you because you got to read the book to
Of
get the book.
course.
The
Absolutely.
book is written in kind of a mystery, so
Yeah,
you
yeah,
don't know what's happening. He eventually is driven out of the country, and when
yeah.
he's driven to the country, he and his family end up on a ship
Mm.
that comes to America. And so that's
Ah,
the book.
yeah, that's it. Well, I certainly was moved by just certainly your little synopsis here today on this show, really, which is fantastic. I mean, you did such a long research. 1 year, you said it took, yeah?
Well, it actually took me more than a year to do it,
Yeah, yeah.
but
No,
then it took a year or two to write the book, and then of course Simon and Schuster is forefront. Simon and Schuster published it. It took them a year to do their work as well.
of course, yeah, no, that's great. And of course, it's amazing how also you've managed to get some research into Queen Victoria's um,
Yeah,
involvement as well, because apart from the UK's recent passing Queen, Queen Elizababeth II,
right.
she is probably the most famous Queen of England.
Yeah,
It always gets mentioned, Um,
she's an amazing woman,
yeah,
and actually,
yeah, yeah.
during the first disaster, she was a very young queen. I
Yeah,
think
all
she
right.
took office, I think it's 16 in 1837 or 6.
All
And
right.
this,
Oh, I didn't know it was that young. Okay, so it's younger than Queen Elizabeth then.
this disaster occurred in 38. So she was
Yeah,
still a teenager,
yeah,
but she
yeah,
was
yeah,
so incensed about children being forced to be in the mine, and especially the
yeah,
little
yeah,
girl, that she wanted to do something to get little girls out of the mine.
yeah.
And so she became intimately involved as a teenager, and then all through her life, because of that first involvement,
Mm.
she was keen on finding out what could be done to help with child labor. And so when Thomas Wright gets involved, he has a very um, interested audience.
Yeah.
Of course, there's a romance that runs through the entire
All
book
right.
as well. It's a very charming and
Yeah, you got to make it. If it's a novel, you got to make it feel like a movie running through your head.
right,
That's the idea of books and novels, isn't it? Really, and everyone has their own version of that movie, don't they?
right.
Visualization of it. So it's fantastic. It's fantastic. When did this book get released? By the way.
Well, the book got released in October, and since that time, it's gone #1 in its class.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
It's done well, and we're pretty happy with it. If you look on Amazon, you can
Yeah.
see the reviews, and there's some very fascinating reviews. It's interesting. There's a movie out, and I'm not sure how widespread it is in the UK, but it's a movie called Sound of Freedom,
Yeah.
and it's about a movie about child trafficking.
Yeah.
And the fellow that it's about, and the fellow who is part of the production staff, is a fellow named Tim Ballard. And this movie is the most successful independent movie ever in America.
Mm.
Sold 200 million worth. And Tim Ballard is the key character in the movie, and it's a true story about child trafficking. And Tim Ballard reviewed Out of Darkness. He has an absolutely wonderful review of the book and his thoughts on that whole subject. Because you're right, child trafficking is still a big issue. In
Yeah.
fact, in San Diego, which is where I live, we're close to Mexico and South America, and we have children still trafficked here. Usually, it's sexual trafficking that they do now, and
Mm.
it's the second largest um, crime in
Mm.
San Diego, which is
Oh,
hard to imagine.
San Diego. You would have never thought
Yes,
it'd be in the US, would you?
you would never guess, but it's
Yeah.
true. And frankly, child trafficking, mostly sexual trafficking these
Yeah.
days,
Yeah.
is bigger now around the world than it's ever been.
Mm. Yeah, this
Doesn't-
is I think there's something happened in Europe actually where but they're always getting them bundled in vans. I think you see pictures and
Right,
photos of it, and sometimes it is actually just miners working, and then they
right,
die in the van. I think some got caught
right,
dying in a van coming to the UK. But
right.
the trafficking, I think, is done in another way where they promise them a job and then they They
Something
come
else.
over. Yeah. So
Well, I don't want to give the wrong impression to your listeners that
no.
this is a book about child trafficking. It's not.
No, it's not. No, it's just if you put your picture into what happened in the Industrial
Right.
Revolution in 1800s, then just what was going on then, and it's got everything in it, like you say, and it's got romance in it as well and everything else. It's just a story, isn't it? A movie, if you like, in a book.
It's really a book about a young man who rises above his very difficult beginnings to achieve great success and finds the love of his life. And in the end, it ends very happily.
Yeah. Well, it's just definitely sounds like a great read there, David, and a really great pleasure having you to tell this, give some synopsis of this book to my audience today. I always love it when some authors come on my show. I've had a fair amount come on actually recently, so it's a great pleasure having you on as an author in my show today. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode. Thanks for listening, and remember, if you want to support what we do, then share, subscribe, and leave a review over on Apple Podcasts. Or head over to my website, davepalmer.com, and click on Rate Show. Well, that's all for now, but I'll see you in the next episode of The Dave Palmer Show.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.